Hello everybody, my name is Kara, and today I'm here with my middle grade magic recommendations video. In case you missed it, I will link the announcement for the readathon down below. It's basically a readathon about celebrating middle grade literature and kind of combating some of the stereotypes or assumptions that people may have about middle grade as an age range. So this video is going to be organized by challenge, which books count for a particular challenge, and then within that they're going to be organized by genre. So starting off with the Own Voices challenge, I'm actually going to direct you to a previous video I did that was a spotlight on some really wonderful Own Voices middle grade books. I will link that down below, but I do have a couple of books to add to that. And the first one is anything that Grace Lynn has written. I have so far only read Starry River of the Sky, and these are just really beautiful fantasy and folklore kind of stories inspired by her Chinese heritage and the folklore from that. And they also have these gorgeous full-page illustrations in them that Grace Lynn painted herself. And this was just such a lovely book about family and about the importance of storytelling, and I really love how Grace Lynn incorporated these myths and this folklore into the story and into these characters' lives in sometimes really surprising ways. Next, I have The Dollmaker of Cracow by R.M. Romero. R.M. Romero is a Jewish author, and there is a very important character in the book who is Jewish. You could argue they're one of the main or primary characters, but the protagonist is not actually Jewish. And this is a combination of historical fiction and fantasy, and we follow a main character who is actually a doll. She's from the land of dolls. And there's some elements of the Nutcracker story in this book as well, in the world that she comes from, and it has been overtaken by rats. And then she comes to the human world, and this book is set during World War II, so of course she realizes that it's not just her own world that has terrible things happen, and she really starts to realize the terrible cruelty that humans are capable of. But it's a book about how there are also good people who are willing to do good things to combat these terrible times and these terrible people, and it's a really beautiful story. And this of course would also double for the serious topics challenge because it does cover World War II and the Holocaust, so just definitely be aware of that if that's not something you want to read about, but it is an incredibly powerful book. So moving on to the Bend the Rules challenge, and the first one has to be one of my favorite authors. You guys probably can guess this, and that is Frances Hardinge. This is her book A Skinful of Shadows, which I actually haven't read yet, and I actually have a whole video on her. I will link that down below if you want more detail on individual books of hers. But across the board, her books are just so complex, so wonderful. I love her main characters, and she tends to write about characters who are kind of ordinary people who get thrown into these situations where they're like, all right, fine, I guess I have to save the world, you know, if there is any world saving to be done. And I absolutely love that. And her world building is always fantastic, and her writing is super complex. I think this is a great example of how middle grade can have this really beautiful and strange and wonderful writing style that a lot of people don't think it can. I've loved all of her books. I think I've given all of the books I've read from her 5 stars, which is pretty amazing. So I highly recommend her. Oh, and she tends to write fantasy or historical type books. I think all of her books have at least some element of fantasy if they're not straight up fantasy. Next, I have the Tiffany Aching series by Terry Pratchett, and I have only read the first 3 books in this series, and I think this is already one of my favorite series I've ever read. Tiffany Aching is again one of those characters who's like a very ordinary girl, and she's like, all right, fine, I guess I'll save everyone because you know, I live in this world too. And I just love her. She's so strong and stubborn, and she does make mistakes, but I always understand why she makes them. But aside from that, she's also an incredibly capable character, which I also love. And this is a fantasy series, by the way. And the reason this one kind of bends the rules a little bit is because I think a lot of people categorize this series within the wider Discworld universe as being YA, but the Discworld books tend to be adult, and Tiffany Aching herself is more in like the middle grade age range. As I said, Tiffany Aching as a character is wonderful. Terry Pratchett's writing is always just the perfect blend of humor and, I don't know, like power, I guess. Like, there are some really important themes that get discussed in these books, and I really love that, and they're not heavy-handed at all, so if you're worried about that, I don't think you need to be. Next, I have The False Prince by Jennifer A. Nielsen, and this is actually the 3rd book, The Shadow Throne, which is the last one I need to read. The 2nd book was okay. It's not that I don't recommend it necessarily, but The False Prince, like, that is definitely my favorite book in the series so far. I think it's a really good kind of bridge book for people who are used to reading YA or adult, because a lot of the story elements are things that you tend to see in older fiction more. Like, it's kind of a battle for a throne type of thing, and we follow our main character Sage, who gets sort of roped into being part of this school of boys, and they're all being trained to sort of audition for who's going to impersonate a prince. This prince who has died many years before in this kingdom. And it's a very dangerous job. But Sage is such a wonderful main character. He's so clever and snarky, and the way he's grown up, like, he's kind of one of those characters who thinks that there's no goodness left in him because of his hard life and everything. But throughout the book, you really see that he is still a good person. Like, he's definitely not a like 100% hero kind of character. And I think that's one of the things that makes his development so interesting to follow. Next I have another favorite author, and that is Mary Haskell, and she tends to write fantasy or like fairy tale retelling type of books. I adore these books. I think my favorite of hers is The Princess Curse, which is a 12 Dancing Princesses retelling, but closely followed by The Castle Beyond Thorns or Behind Thorns. Both of those are just wonderful books. Her books are just magical, and it's a little hard to explain why I click with them so much, but this feeling of like this old folklore type of setting, and the writing I really love, and her main characters I just adore. Like I really, really connect to them in ways that are, again, kind of hard to explain. Like, you know, there's sometimes those authors where it's like you're just on the same wavelength, and it's like everything they write is like it feels like it's for you. She's one of those authors, but I think even if you don't have that like really intense personal connection with her books, just they're very solid like fantasy books, and the character development is, again, like really well done. The plot is also really interesting. Like I would say that her books, some of them more than others, are more character focused, but I still think there's enough happening to keep you like moving through the story and everything. Next, I have another favorite series, and that is the Artemis Fowl series by Owen Colfer. We are of course doing our Artemis Fowl read along at the time that I am filming and posting this, so it is currently still ongoing, but even before we started doing that, this has always been one of my favorite series, and I feel like this series is a really great one for people who either tend to read just sci-fi or just fantasy, because I feel like this is like a really perfect middle ground, because there are fantastical creatures but they have kind of futuristic technology, and again, you're kind of probably noticing a trend in these books, but there is fantastic character development in this series, not just for Artemis, the main character, but I think for Holly too, who you could argue is like the other protagonist of the series, but just really fun, really action-packed. I think there is definitely like a suspension of disbelief with some of these like heists or storylines. Like you kind of have to accept that Artemis Fowl is like a 12-year-old genius and he can just do all of these things. But I don't mind that, because again, like the characters are so wonderful. The writing can be really, really funny. Just a really clever take on fairies and kind of like the fair folk and everything. Next is sort of an honorable mention, because I don't know if anybody considers this book middle grade except me, and that's because I'm really bad at predicting these kinds of age ranges, which I've talked about before. So like The Arithmetist by Brandon Sanderson, I assumed that was a middle grade. I don't know why. I'm really bad at picking up on character ages too, so maybe that's the problem. I think I've seen a lot of people shelf it as YA though, but I feel like it straddles that line really well. I think younger readers could definitely read it, even though it does get like quite creepy with some of it. It's more of like an action focused book, which I don't tend to enjoy as much. Like it's much more about the plot and the mystery and all these twists and turns rather than the characters themselves. So even though I did enjoy the characters, what really drew me in was the world and this kind of chalk magic and everything. And that's sort of like a sci-fi slash fantasy book is what I would consider it. And last in this category is Emily of New Moon. This is the second book, Emily Climbs by L.M. Montgomery. I actually need to continue this series, but this is a classic series. And if you've read Anne of Green Gables, I can see why people would kind of conflate the two, because obviously the same author wrote those. And they do follow young girls who are kind of, it's like a coming of age series sort of. I've just read the first Emily book and I can already see that they're very different. Like Emily and Anne are not completely different people. Like I feel like they would get along, but it's not just a rehash. I think that the Emily books seem to be a little bit darker. This is kind of a, I guess, lesser hyped option, you know, in the world of classics. The next category is the dark or serious one, the one that handles heavy topics, which doesn't necessarily have to be sad, but it could be. The first one I have is Beastkeeper by Kat Hellison. This is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, and I think it's fantastic. It's definitely very dark. There are some themes about family and love and how love can kind of twist people, or the lack of love can too. And I think it handles them in really, really mature ways. The writing and the atmosphere is just stunning in this book. I have mentioned it before, how the first time I read it, I almost unhauled it. Like I didn't think that much of it. And then I reread it for a challenge I was doing, and I fell in love with it. It's now one of my favorite retellings. Next, I have The Time series by Megan Morrison. This is the third and most recent book, Transformed: The Perils of the Frog Prince. And I actually didn't realize this series was middle grade until a friend, actually it might have been Yvette, commented saying like, oh, your middle grade recommendations, like I really, like that one really sounds interesting. And I'm like, I guess this is considered middle grade. I didn't realize that. So I think this is another one that can kind of fall between middle grade and YA, but the reason I put it in this category is because each book handles some really, really serious topics in, I think, a really thoughtful way. I think that the way that Megan Morrison incorporates the fantasy world and the serious real world issues is just phenomenal. The first book deals a lot with unhealthy or abusive relationships. The second book deals a lot with workers' rights and like sweatshops, labor unions, that kind of thing. And this third book deals a lot with like election politics and like different forms of government and what government owes its people. And there's also like a subplot about GMOs and kind of this idea of what people are willing to do for what they perceive as the greater good. And I just think that is handled really wonderfully. And besides that, I think the world of this series is so interesting. It seems so like bubblegum sweet on top, and then you get further into the book and you're like, this is actually like really dark in some ways. And again, as for the character development, it's just wonderful. That's a common theme with my favorite series, is I have to be really invested in the characters and I have to really want to follow them on their journey, and I absolutely did with these. Next, a quick mention to The Stone Girl Story by Sarah Beth Durst. And this is about a girl who is made out of stone. She was carved by a stonemaker, and he has since passed away many years ago, and he also carved all of these animals that are kind of her family. And the book starts when she notices that the charms on these animals are starting to wear off. So they're essentially going to die. So she decides to go on this journey to find a stone carver to kind of bring them back. And this is just a really wonderful book. Ending got like really emotional for me in a way I wasn't necessarily expecting, and it's got a lot of wonderful things about like family and companionship, and like the importance of storytelling is definitely a really huge theme. I think if you don't like strong themes in your books, you might not like this one as much, because they really do emphasize the idea that like the power of stories and what storytelling can do, but I actually really enjoyed that. Next is The Shadow Spinner, and I don't actually remember the author. I think is it Susan something? This is a 1001 Nights retelling that's kind of told from the side character's perspective. And this one I would consider dark or serious because it doesn't shy away from the darker elements of the 1001 Nights. Like, it doesn't turn the fairy tale into a straight up romance, even though it is told from a character who is like a side character in the story. And I just really like it. Like, I think about this book a lot actually, and the way it handled some of those things. Next is The Girl Who Drank the Moon by Kelly Barnhill, and this is another one that handles some really, really heavy things, which is obviously why it's in this category. There's this village that sacrifices children to the witch every year, and what they don't know is the witch is actually a good witch, and she takes them and gives them a good home. The book starts when she accidentally feeds moonlight to a baby instead of starlight, and that gives her these incredible powers. And there's all these like connecting plot lines that I think the author handles so beautifully. And again, like very heavy material in this about loss and grief. And something that my friend and co-host Kelly actually pointed out is that it's not the best book from the adoption perspective. Like, I don't think you should read this one if you or your family has experience with adoption, because I think that could be a very negative focus on it. But aside from that, I think it is a really solid book. Heartbreaking, but filling in some ways. Next is a series I'm not going to spend too much time on because I have gushed about it repeatedly on my channel, but that is the Red Abbey Chronicles by Maria Turchaninov, translated by A.A. Prime. And the first book is Marisi, and the reason this is in this category is throughout the first two books that I have read in the series, it doesn't shy away from talking about some horrible things. And I think this also would fit in the category of bending the rules, because the second book definitely feels adult, but the first one feels more middle grade. But even in the first one, like, they handle like an honor killing. Like, they talk about one of the girls has this in her past, and this series is just about like this group of women who take in girls who are fleeing hardship that is generally inflicted by men. It's just a wonderful story about sisterhood and about strength and overcoming hardship, and again, like, very feminist. I highly recommend it, but very dark, especially the second book. I'll actually link a recommendations video where I talk about the series because I go into more detail on some of the content warnings. Next is the Charlie Bone books by Jenny Nimmo. This is the first one, Midnight for Charlie Bone. This is a series that I loved as a kid and I still love today, and I think it got like unfairly shortchanged by the fact that it came out around the same time Harry Potter did, and the fact that it involves a magical school. I think a lot of people wrote it off as like a Harry Potter knockoff, and I don't think it is. Like, I really don't think it's similar to Harry Potter at all, outside of the fact that yes, there is a magical school. The magical school in this book, Bloor's Academy, is actually really negative. Like, it's a really dark one, and that's actually why it's in this category, is because I think there's a lot of like dark themes in these books, which the Harry Potter books definitely have too. But I think like the school and the setting itself, it feels a lot grimmer than I think these magical boarding school novels tend to be, and I like that. I think it was handled really well and balanced with the lighter elements of the story, and this whole cast of characters I absolutely love. Like, I love their friendships. I love how, like, the different things they bring to the table, both like through their powers and through their personality. Next is Liesl and Poe, and I don't remember the author on that one either. Is it Lauren Oliver? This is a really beautiful story. The writing is really wonderful, and it's a very quiet and kind of bittersweet story because it is a lot about, like, it does talk a lot about grief. It's one that I didn't love when I read it, but I think about it a lot. I realize I have been completely forgetting to tell you the genres for some of these. So basically all the ones I've talked about in the dark or serious category so far have been fantasy or like fairy tale / fantasy. Next, I have another kind of classic fantasy or sci-fi author, and that is Diana Wynne Jones. This is the fourth book in the Dale Quartet, which is the only one I still need to read in this series. And I'm not going to go into each individual book of hers, but she wrote Howl's Moving Castle, which I think is wonderful. And her books consistently have some really serious themes. There's things about like abusive home life. Again, grief is a very common theme here. Those are just a couple off the top of my head. But her books are always like really whimsical, but also like they make sense. Like the way she introduces you to things is like, it's such a logical way of approaching this fantasy world or like a science fiction world. It's like whimsical, but in a way that doesn't feel artificial, I guess. Next is The Secret Horses of Briar Hill, and again, I don't remember the author for this one. This is historical fiction slash kind of magical realism or fantasy. It's hard to tell. This one is really heartbreaking in some places. I think it takes place during the Second World War and involves a group of children in a hospital. And I'm definitely going to butcher the synopsis if I try to give it for this one, but it's one of those where it's like they find something magical, and is it really magical or is it just their imagination? Next is The Making of Molly by Anna Carey, and this is a historical fiction set in Ireland during the time when women were trying to get the vote, and our main character Molly, she sort of gets swept up in that unintentionally. And this was really fun. It's like written in a very like conversational kind of way, and this one I think could also fit for the bend the rules category because I think her age is closer to a YA, but some of the story elements feel more middle grade, but in the context of the story, she would almost be considered an adult because of like the time she grew up. So I feel like it's kind of a good blend of those things. I also have to mention that, you know, the Holmes series, this is a historical fiction kind of Sherlock Holmes retelling. We follow Sherlock and Mycroft's younger sister Enola, and in the first book her mom goes missing and she has to like try and track her down, figure out what happened to her, and sort of use her own deductive abilities. And I just really enjoyed this first book. I own multiple books in the series and I do want to continue. I just really like the way that these handle like feminist topics and things in the time period. I have a few that I'm going to mention very quickly, and those are The View from Saturday by E.L. Konigsberg, Wynne Dixie by an author that I don't actually remember, and then Sharon Creech in general as an author. And these are all like contemporary books, although Sharon Creech, I think her books can sometimes lean a little bit, like a tiny bit magical realism almost. I think when I read them, I didn't know what that genre was, so I don't remember if that was how they were described or not. But I feel like the common thread in these, especially Wynne Dixie and Sharon Creech, there's a lot about family life and loss and grief. Granny Torelli Makes Soup was all by Sharon Creech was always one of my favorites because of Wynne Dixie is like a really heartbreaking book in a lot of ways that I think people tend to forget how sad it is. Which also reminds me, Tech Everlasting by Natalie Babbitt. That's a great middle grade that handles a really serious topic like immortality. And The View from Saturday is more lighthearted than those, but it's about these like group of kids coming together and forming this friendship, and they're all kind of misfits in their own ways, but they find each other, and it's just a beautiful story. It's one of my favorites. Now into some more general recommendations. These are just going to be more on genre. First, I have Gail Carson Levine, and she wrote fairy tale retellings and fantasy books. I should say writes because she's still writing them. My favorite has always been The Two Princesses of Bamar, but Elle Enchanted is also wonderful. Fairest is another fantastic one that I don't think gets as much attention as it maybe deserves. But this is just a reminder that she's wonderful. I just love her writing and her worlds and her main characters. They really stick with me. Next, I have a very underhyped series, and that is the Dreamdark books by Laini Taylor. This is her middle grade fantasy fairy series that I don't think a lot of people know about. Supposedly, we are supposed to get a third book at some point. Hopefully that will happen, although the second one doesn't end on a huge cliffhanger. Like, I think you can read them as two books rather than waiting for a third book, but I'd love to have a third book. And if more people read and talk about these, maybe we'll get that. But these are just really great, like more like classic fairies, I think, because they're small and they're mischievous, and like the story feels more like classic Journey, you know, like going on a journey to defeat the big bad and everything. But I think aside from that, the world building and some of the characters are really unique, and I really like that. Also, the Divide Trilogy by Susan Kay. This is one of my favorite series from when I was younger, and it's about a boy named Felix who has a congenital heart condition, and he visits the divide in, is it South America, I think, where like the two continental plates line up, and basically he crosses that and magic happens and he gets transported to this magical world, and he meets an elf girl named Bethany, and they have a lot of adventures from there. And I just love this series so much. I've seen some people who didn't like it. They felt like it was kind of derivative, and maybe it's partly because I read this when I was a lot younger. I hadn't read as much fantasy, but I still really enjoy it. And this also could probably fit in the serious subject matter category because there are things about like product testing and like shady business practices, kind of like the time books that I mentioned. And there's obviously the fact that Felix is dying. He's grown up his whole life knowing that he's going to die someday from this heart condition. And I think it's just like a wonderful series, and Bethany and Felix's friendship is just so wonderful. Another one you've probably heard of is Shannon Hale. I've only read the first Goose Girl book, but I want to continue the series. This is actually a fairy tale retelling of the Goose Girl. I think the later books in the series aren't fairy tale retellings, but I just love the way Shannon Hale writes. It's like this very like smooth and easy to read writing style, but that doesn't feel overly simplistic. Next is Flora Segunda by Isabeau S. Wills. Now this is one where I have read the second book and I wasn't as much in love with it, and I don't plan to read the third one, but I can officially recommend the first book, and I think you could read it as a standalone. This is sort of a fantasy, like, alternate history book, and it's set in, like, the region of California, but it's as if the Aztecs have kind of taken over the area. It's really interesting, and I love the world building. Like, that's one of my favorite things about it. And Floras herself is, like, a really interesting character, and it's a really hard book to describe. The full title of the book kind of gives you a better idea of what the story's about, but it's like a magical house that she gets trapped in, and it's a really good time. It's like a super weird book, but if you tend to like kind of weird fantasy books, I think you might like this one. I also want to recommend the Dragon Slippers trilogy by Jessica Day George. Now, I have read a lot of Jessica Day George books that I have really enjoyed. There's a really wonderful female friendship in this book. I love the fact that, like, so much of the plot is based around, like, crafts, like sewing and making dresses. The third book wasn't my favorite, but I do think that the first two books are wonderful. The Thieves of Ostia by Caroline Lawrence is a historical fiction, like, middle grade mystery, and this series is set during ancient Rome. I've only read the first book, but I really want to continue the series. It's quite a long series. One of the things I loved about that book is that the kids feel like kids, but they use the skills they have as young people. Like, they're not walking around like miniature adults, you know. That's kind of a pet peeve of mine for when authors write middle grade books, is if they feel like they're basically just adults, but, you know, they say that they're 12. And it didn't feel like that with this book. Like, they felt like very believable children, but like very smart children. There's one point where one of the characters gets information out of another character by, like, pretending to be like, oh, like, we're these cute little kids and we're just gonna wait for our mom because we're lost or something. Like, they play off of people's expectations. Next, I have a classic recommendation for you, and that is The Ordinary Princess by MMK. This is, like, just a classic fairy tale, but with kind of a Patricia C. Reedy sort of twist in that she's an ordinary princess. And this is just such a cozy kind of book. It's very short too. If you're looking for something just warm and sweet and just that feels like you're reading like a fairy tale but with modern humor and sensibilities, I think you would really enjoy this one. I also want to mention Flipped by Wynne Van Draenen. This is, I think, kind of a classic middle grade at this point, and I know some people have read it recently and been disappointed in it, which I can understand, but I really like it. It's got more of a romance focus than I think middle grade tends to have, but the way that it handles, like, people growing apart or growing closer, or like first impressions of people and whether you live up to them or not, and like learning that people you love and the people that you care about, like, sometimes you find out that they're not the person you thought they were. This is all very vague. For another fantasy / historical fiction recommendation, I have Eva Ibbetson's books. This is Dragonfly Pool, which I don't think I've actually read before. I just love her middle grade so much. I have read a couple of her adult books and I hated them, but her middle grade is just so whimsical and wonderful, and her characters are just so strong and interesting, and, like, the friendships in her books are just fantastic. I don't know if I could pick a favorite, because I love Journey to the River Sea, which is, like, set on the Amazon River, but I also really love Island of the Ants, which is, like, has a bunch of magical creatures and everything. But her books are always just cozy and comforting, but with some serious things that these kids are dealing with. And finally, the last recommendation is just kind of a general recommendation about these kinds of, like, storybooks. This is The Barefoot Book of Stories from the Opera by Shahrukh Hussain, illustrated by James Mayhew. And these like storybooks that are kind of intended as, like, read-alouds to children, I imagine, like, these can be really wonderful picks for something like this, because I have loved reading these books since I was the target audience, but I continue to love reading them to this day. This one is not one that I had a lot of nostalgia for. I never read this when I was little, but I still really enjoyed it reading it as an adult. And then there's also a couple of good graphic novel picks for this. I think it's harder to tell when a graphic novel is middle grade versus, like, a general audience. But I think that Prince and the Dressmaker by Jen Wong would qualify, which I just read last month and really enjoyed. And The Tea Dragon Society by Katie O'Neill. This is just really lovely with beautiful artwork and just, like, the most wholesome story ever. And I love the Tea Dragons. So just, like, keep those things in mind too. If you're having trouble picking something for a particular challenge or genre, like, look into, like, graphic novels or, like, picture books or storybooks or something like that. Okay, everybody, so I tried to get as many middle grade books that I had enjoyed and could recommend as I could think of into this one video, so I hope it wasn't too long. It probably was. Keep an eye out for some of my other co-hosts and their recommendations video. I will definitely link those down below when they go up. Let me know if you guys have read any of these or if you're planning to read them for the readathon or what. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!